Hello, everyone, and welcome to our June 2021 webinar, Get Your Design in Control. Before we get started in the technical topic, I'd like to introduce our company if you haven't had a chance to interact with us before. So we are Brentwood CKC, a Pharmalex company. We're headquartered in Sydney. We have been established and providing consulting services for over 20 years, primarily in the medical device sector. And we've expanded more recently in pharmaceutical and other therapeutic areas. Since April 2021, we had the pleasure to merge with the Pharmalex Group, which is really increasing our international footprint, leveraging on additional capabilities, and being able to deliver additional services to our clients. I'd like to introduce the presenters today. I have the pleasure of being joined by Belinda Dowsett.
Thank you. As Jean mentioned, my name is Belinda Dowsett, and I am a senior consultant and the QA manager at Brentwood CKC. A little bit of my background: I've been heavily involved in quality management system implementation within the medical devices industry, supported a number of audits across the TGA, FDA, and notified bodies, and plenty of experience in post-market surveillance. And yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Belinda. And I'm Jean Boudot. I'm Device Consulting Manager for Brentwood CKC, and I'm also a senior consultant here. I've joined the company in 2017. My main expertise is in the space of regulatory in the main jurisdictions of the US, EU, and Australia, and obviously in quality management systems, including auditing. So I've held various roles in the industry in quality assurance, project management, and regulatory affairs. In terms of our agenda today, so we'll start with some introductions on design controls. We'll then go through the different phases of design controls as defined by standards. So talking about design planning and the different phases of design controls, going through design inputs, risk management, design outputs, and the associated documentation, design reviews, verification, validation, transfer. And then we'll look into how all of those elements fit into the design documentation and regulatory applications for products. We'll discuss the management of design changes, touch on software products specifically, and we'll wrap up with our key takeaways and some of the questions. So I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone who's had a chance to submit some questions ahead of time. We'll try to address those ones first, and obviously we'll provide some details at the end of the presentations if you've got additional questions along the way that you'd like to ask. So I'll now hand over to Belinda for the introductions.
Okay, thank you. I think probably the first place we need to start with this presentation is just a discussion on what exactly we mean by design controls. So essentially what we're talking about here is a set of quality practices and procedures. It's a process that supports the design and development of a product from the concept phase right through to marketing. The purpose of the design control process itself is to help to produce and compile a set of records that demonstrates that the device meets the user needs, the intended uses, and that any specified requirements, including those very specific regulatory requirements. Also, the design controls help you to control and continuously improve a product design. And finally, as we mentioned in the tagline for this webinar, design controls are critical to support the regulatory applications and post-market compliance. So looking at the quality management system lifecycle as a whole, we quite often get asked this question about at what point do we need to actually implement a design control process? And my answer to that is always right at the very beginning. So your QMS design processes really do need to be established prior to commencing any product development. What you can see here on this timeline is right at the beginning, we have the establishment of the QMS control processes. This could be ISO 13485, MDSAP, 21 CFR 820, and also considering the software development standards there as well, IEC 62304. Next, we move into the design planning and product development, which we'll go into a lot more detail in this presentation. We look at the QMS certifications and product registrations. Finally, we have the point of releasing to the market, and once it's on the market, the post-market surveillance activities commence. So the design planning itself, what we mean by this design planning is it's really the project management phase. It describes everything that you will be doing to carry out the design activities, such as who is on the project, what are the timelines. It provides those specific references and milestones within the project for the design and development. You identify any interactions with other processes within your business. And the typical implementation at this stage is defining your design procedures, defining those position descriptions, including responsibilities and authorities, and the project-specific components as well. So your development and your resource plans, those specific people who will be involved on their team, the schedule, and of course the QA plan. So the design control stages themselves, as I mentioned, we like to encourage a design control process to be developed right at the very beginning. But we do also understand that there's these sort of the informal phases right at the very beginning of a concept of a design, which is what we've got in this left box. These are your implicit requirements. So this is, like I mentioned, an informal phase, and there's all those activities that are typically conducted outside of a formalized design control, such as pre-planning, conversations, interviews with end users, and really getting an idea of sort of the research and the feasibility of what you're trying to do. We then move into the more formalized design control process, and there's explicit requirements within this phase. So this is the point at which you need to have your design and development processes established. It's when you move from concept and outside of the QMS to actually requiring a design control process. Within this phase, you typically would develop your plans, your protocols. You'd start generating your records. You'd move into requiring reviews and approvals, and you follow all of those QMS procedures that you've defined as well. And we'll obviously go into a lot more detail of these specific boxes we've highlighted here in those phase gates as well. Thank you, Sean. So the design inputs themselves, there's lots of things obviously that need to be considered when you begin the design input phase of your project development. These are probably just some of the things that you need to consider. We have our standards, so your ISO standards, any industry standards, ASDM standards that you form an input to your design. You take advice and information from your end customer and end users or patients. You obviously consider your regulatory requirements. What are the regulators requiring from you with these types of devices? Any corporate input as well. And the final item we have here is the risk assessment. So what risks do we need to consider with this type of product as well? And all of these inputs then go into what we would form as the design requirements documents. So when you're documenting your design inputs, or your design control process itself should ensure that your design inputs are written in such a way that they address the user's needs and intended uses in measurable terms. You want to make sure that they're written in a way that they're complete, they're non-ambiguous, and they're not conflicting. And all of those design inputs as well need to be documented, they should be reviewed, and they need to be approved. So the mandatory design inputs that we consider here, from the previous slide, we have those regulatory safety and performance requirements. So considering things like the TGA's essential principles or the European general safety and performance requirements, and any other equivalent types of requirements from other jurisdictions. The other design input that's obviously critical in this case is your preliminary risk assessment. In terms of recommended design inputs, these obviously aren't mandatory, but you would need to consider any sort of applicable harmonized or consensus standards. But like I say, they're not compulsory, but there is a clear expectation from regulatory assessors that you've considered these types of inputs. And I think the final point to be made there as well is as you're developing those design inputs, you should be considering your verification and validation, how you are actually going to map these design inputs to the outputs and how you're going to validate that against your user needs.
Thanks, Belinda. So I'm just going to touch very quickly on risk management. So as Belinda mentioned, risk management is part of the design inputs that have to be considered. But some of the key points there in terms of that process. So the expected standard to be complied with is ISO 14971. This is really a process that's iterative throughout the product development and where the file is going to be maintained over time through the entire product lifecycle and not just the initial phase of product development. So there's a number of documents that are expected as part of that, the deliverables for compliance to that standard. That includes a risk management plan where you'll be identifying your criteria for risk management, the team that's going to be involved in the risk management process, in the approvals, the analysis, and all of those phases, the methods that you're going to be used to evaluate the risks. And then subsequently to this plan being established, follow phases of actual evaluation of the risks and the final reporting. So one point that's quite important to highlight here is that it's quite often missed that preliminary risk analysis should be documented quite early on, as soon as you're aware of the device intended use, so that those inputs can actually flow into your design process and you'll be able to identify product features, types of testings that you might need to conduct and that require verification and validation, early on. And as the design progresses, then those activities are going to be refined and you'll be able to actually close the loops upon completion of your design and your verification and validation, where conclusion on risk-benefit ratios would be drawn at the end of the process. So as I mentioned, this is a process which is iterative through design and development. And as the product has been released, obviously information from the field, the post-production phase, has to be collected along the way and is going to flow back into the original assumptions that were made as part of that design. So in terms of design outputs, which is another element defined in the various standards of design controls, 13485 and the likes. So design outputs are really the result of that design effort. So they are outputs that are generated at the very end of the design process, but outputs also are documents which are generated at the end of each phase of the design. So the number of outputs, depending on the product complexity, can be quite substantial, as you can imagine, particularly if you've got devices that involve multiple technical disciplines, software, mechanical, electrical. The number of outputs can be quite significant. Ultimately, all of the inputs include the information that define the finished device, such as the actual, obviously, device specifications, but also all of your packaging specifications, the process requirements for you to be able to manufacture, utilize the product in the field, and the labeling information that's going to accompany the device. So essentially, all of the outputs that have been generated as part of that process form your device master record. And we're going to touch on that a little bit later on as well. So as I mentioned before, design outputs are a mandatory sort of a step in the design control phase. And as such, the design control procedure that you've got in place need to define what those outputs are going to be. So the outputs need to allow demonstration of product conformance to the input requirements that you've defined. So typically, in order to be able to demonstrate that you've implemented all of the inputs, you would require some form of traceability from the output back to the input requirements of your design. It's always good to refer to measurable acceptance criteria. And this is an aspect that we will cover in the verification and validation aspects as well. And obviously, all of the outputs that are generated as part of design and development have to be documented, reviewed, and approved before release as part of your documentation control procedure. So one of the good practices here, which really make your file, audit ready in a sense, is to document a deliverable matrix where you've got a documented procedure that defines for each phase of your product development what outputs are going to be generated by each technical discipline. And you can do that per phase of your design and development and per function. Obviously, the types of outputs that are generated and how to actually define those outputs, templates, etc., can also be identified in such procedures. So we'll talk a little bit about design reviews. That's a concept that's also highlighted in the standards. So the design reviews have to be documented, comprehensive, and systematic. The standard does not actually define what phases have to be reviewed, but it's up to your internal procedures to define which phases you're going to review. So this is something that you would define, as I mentioned, in your internal procedures. This is something that you may also decide to define specifically for one project as part of your design planning phase. So the scope and the format of design reviews can vary. That's really, again, dependent on the complexity of your device, the complexity of the particular project that you're working on. They can be desk reviews, or they can be actually structured meetings that involve the cross-functional team. The process itself is, by definition, an examination at appropriate stages. So you've got a graph on the left-hand side of the slide that defines possible stages where design reviews may occur. You need to have at least one formal design review conducted and recorded as part of your design and development process. It's a process that's carried out by an appropriate team, and appropriate team requires an independent reviewer. So as for many other components of the quality management system, independency and objectivity is a very important criteria to make sure that the output is effective. So you must involve somebody that's independent from the work being produced to actually review and critically evaluate the design phase. It's an examination of the adequacy of the design requirements, of the capability of your design to meet those requirements, and in order to identify potential issues that need to be resolved prior to, obviously, the design release phase. Verification and validation, so design verification and validation, I should say, is a very important phase of design and development. There's often some confusion between what verification means and what validation means. Not every single requirement will necessarily require both verification and validation, but your design plans must define how you're going to be performing those V&V activities. Essentially, the main difference is the intent of verification in comparison to validation. Verification is, by principle, a check that you've made the product correctly, where you will verify technical parameters and specifications have been implemented adequately. This is something that happens throughout the design process, and where you compare, as I said, specific measurable outputs against input specifications. On the other hand, validation is really about the perspective from the end user. So this is to verify that you've made the correct product as opposed to you've made the product correctly. So you'll be really demonstrating that the user requirements have been satisfied, that your claims are substantiated, and generally that involves product evaluation that are under actual or simulated use conditions, as if you were representing the final use of the product once released. One of the best ways to complete those verification and validation activities, obviously each of those activities can be discrete and address specific requirements. But again, traceability through design and development is very important to make sure that you've addressed all requirements that you've identified at the beginning of the process. And the best way to do that is really to maintain a traceability matrix. This is an example here where we can see translation from the left-hand side and back to the right-hand side of the slide, where you would have a very generic user needs, such as, well, I need my product to be sterile. And then your input becomes a little bit more specific, where you would say, well, I need the product to be sterile and compliant with that particular standard. the output of this process would be your actual definition of the sterilization cycle per that standard, packaging specification, shape life specifications, specifically established for that particular product. And obviously verification and validation activities are going to be essentially the results. So verification will be the testing for your packaging integrity, the shelf life data that you've collected. And the validation will actually be the confirmation that the user needs have been implemented, such as the fact that there's no infections in the clinic, or that the incidence of that is at a particular rate. I'll now hand over back to Belinda to talk about design transfer.
Thank you. So we've got to this point, we've gone through our identification of our user needs, we've defined our design inputs, we've mapped that to the outputs, and we've verified and we've validated. So we're now at the point that we're looking to transfer the product from a design through to a production part. So this is at the point, like I say, that the design specifications actually become product specifications. The goal here being that the product is fully defined by the design team, and the design team can then transfer their knowledge to the production entity. This could be an in-house facility or a subcontracted manufacturer as well. There's scope within this phase as well to transfer in stages, so by part, or transfer the full production at one point. The point to be made here, though, is that the actual process for the design transfer should be defined within the design plan. Okay, so an example process of how the design transfer would look. So you will have here the approved design specs on the left-hand side. These will provide an input to the process, including the process FMEA. You'll develop the process specifications for manufacturing. There'll be the process validation, including the IQ, OQ, PQ validation requirements. You'll develop some approved parts. You'll conduct a validation build. And at the end point of that, you'll have the approved production specifications. So some of the deliverables that may be produced as a result of the design transfer activities would be your material flow chart. Your bill of materials as well will come into that. Your process FMEA, the control plan traceable to the design specification or the drawing, depending on the type of part you're producing. The manufacturing procedures and the setups, the full list of information on how to actually manufacture that part. Any evidence of process validation, so the validation protocols and reports, and part of this is obviously going to be including the verification that all the staff involved in that manufacturing process have completed the required training. And the production part inspection approval, how are you actually going to QC these parts to ensure that you're releasing conforming product at the end. So sort of tying all of this back to what we're producing as part of a design control activity to how we're using this information to support our future regulatory application. So this slide here, and as Jean mentioned earlier, we introduced this term of a device master record. And what we see a lot is this confusion between all these terms, a DHF, a tech file, a DMR. So looking at this top box here, the yellow box, these are all interchangeable terms. So the design history file is a US term. We have the technical file coming from the Europeans, and the medical device file is introduced in ISO 13485. But these all essentially contain very similar types of documents. The DHF or the tech file will contain the full description of the design process, exactly what has been done to produce that product. The inputs, the outputs, the verification and validation reports. It will also include your design planning documents and your project management records as well. The DMR, however, the device master record, these are your device and your process specifications that are required for manufacturing. This is all of your current specifications and procedures that are used to manufacture or create the current version of the product. It won't include any of the project-specific documentation or anything related to previous version. It just relates to the single product being produced.
Thanks, Belinda. So I'm just going to cover the management of design changes. So design changes are going to be required at any point in time, either through the design and development phase as you go through multiple iterations of your design and the design evolves over time, but also obviously post-release. So it's important and it's required by standards that you've got control mechanisms to produce those design changes and make sure that you evaluate the impact. So the goal of that process is really to ensure that the product or the processes that you are going to be changing remain in that validated state or disapproved state, that the product configuration that you are producing is fully known and approved at all times, so that you don't have any changes that are made without this going through that review cycle that we've presented before. And that obviously the impact of the change is evaluated prior to implementation. So it's very important to, as I mentioned, have that control mechanism in place where you can review the proposed change, evaluate the impact of that change on various other activities, your verification, validation activities, your manufacturing processes, your current stocks, but also, and most importantly, the regulatory status of your product. So whether or not those changes are being made in that pre-market phase or post-market phase, then the nature of the assessment is going to be different, and you'll be needing to consider possible field implications, the markings that you've obtained from the regulators and the various approvals, as well as any other external product certifications. So as I mentioned, the evaluation for significance of each change must occur during product development, but also post-release, and that has to be done as per documented procedure. So that obviously follows the same principle as for your original design controls. And an important point to note here is that depending on the jurisdiction or the country where your product is going to be released, the regulators may define different criteria for what they view as being significant and require notification prior to implementation. So you must incorporate those guidance documents, such as FDA guidance documents, TGA changes within your internal procedures. So I'm just going to run through an example here of presentation of how you can manage that change control. Each change should really be identified in a unique manner. So typically we see, change control mechanisms, change note or change request forms. You would need to define the description of the modification. So why you're actually changing the product or the process, and what you're actually changing on that product or that process, what's the difference with the previous design, the potential impact to safety and efficacy. So again, this is where we link with the risk management activities. You identify either by way of regression or by way of a risk assessment, what's the impact of that change and what might be the implications to the patient, but also in terms of the impact to your verification and validation activities. So obviously you're going to be changing, for example, the product specification. That's going to flow into some of the documentation updates that you need to make, but also in terms of repeating possibly certain tests that you have to repeat in order to verify implementation. The verification activities must also be documented for the implementation of that change with very clear acceptance criteria and rationale, and obviously your results. So if you maintain a history of changes documented in this fashion, that's going to help you putting together regulatory applications down the line.
Okay, so what about software products? And I think this was almost one of the subjects of the questions that we received in preparation for this webinar as well. So looking at the types of standards that we've discussed in this presentation with the design and development, so looking at 13485 and 21 CFR 820, how do these requirements fit in with what's required for the development of a software product? What we have here on this slide is actually the overlay between ISO 13485 and the software development lifecycle that's defined within IEC 62304. So these yellow or the orange blocks above here are your the sections within 13485. And those items within are the particular terms and deliverables that are driven with 62304. So within the design planning phase, you're going to have such things as your software development planning, your risk management planning, and your regulatory and clinical strategy. All of those things are sort of common across a software product to another sort of hardware product. However, within your design inputs, you start to see some of those differences or some of those software specific requirements, looking particularly at cybersecurity or usability or mobile app guidance as well that comes through from the regulators. On the right there with the design inputs, again, we're seeing a lot of those software specific activities, your software integration, your configuration management, and finally the definition of your final software build as well. This actually continues over onto the next slide as well, which we have with the design verification, transfer, and design validation. So your design verification stage looks a little bit different. We're looking at your unit verifications, your system verifications, any sort of integration testing, problem resolution. And at the point that you've finally verified your software design, you transfer that across with your final software build specification, your configuration management, and also defining the installation qualifications as well. The design validation for a software, again, looks a little bit different. So you'd start to look at your clinical evaluation and your usability testing and user acceptance testing. The term deployment is not something that we see within ISO 13485, but it's essentially at the point that your product goes into the market, at what point you make that product available to your end users. And it's at this point that you are then subject to those post-market surveillance requirements, but also the software maintenance. How are you going to manage those bug fixes? How are you going to support your end users through the life of your software? Across the bottom finally as well, sorry, Jean, I've just skipped back a slide. Across the bottom there, we have the overlay with the QMS and with risk management as well, further demonstrating that the risk management, it goes across the full design and development process. So next up, the key takeaways. I think Jean's going to take you through the key takeaways of our presentation today.
Thanks, Belinda. So key takeaways and conclusions. So the planning really is everything into that process of design controls. So the process itself is something which has to be documented, but within your specific project, you must also have some documents that actually explain how you're going to be carrying out the particular development activity. The documentation, obviously, as we sort of alluded to along the presentation, has a direct influence on the regulatory approvals. So what we sometimes experience is the regulatory partner to be involved at the very end of the process once the design has been finalized, and with the regulatory application coming at the very, very end. What's a better practice here is really to appreciate that the entire design file that's been produced over time is going to be the source information that's going to be utilized in those regulatory applications, and therefore the involvement of the regulatory representative throughout the process from inputs to outputs and post-release is really essential to the success of your applications and to your overall regulatory compliance. In terms of software, we touched on that towards the end of the presentation, and as you know, we've presented the software deliverables, particularly those that are defined through the various standards for software and guidance documents, such as IEC 62304. Those are entirely compatible with standard design control processes and the 13485, your MDSAP, your 21 CFR and the likes. So it's possible to actually produce a quality management system which can incorporate both and allow you to meet the design control requirements at the same time. The actual technical file, which includes your risk management file, clinical evidence, and all of the documents, is obviously a living document. So whilst the main controls really start from that design input phase that we presented, the product will evolve over time, changes will be required, and there's an expectation from the regulator that you do maintain those files in place so that they remain accurate and complete at any point in time. So this really leads us now to questions and answers. So I'd like to take a moment, first of all, to thank all participants that have submitted their questions ahead of time. The first question that we received was really in relation to the design controls within the new EU MDR, the 2017-745. And the question is, so within that framework, are design controls nice to have or need to have? So Belinda, do you want to provide some perspectives on this?
Yes. So I suppose the answer here, the short answer, is that the implementation of the new MDR regulations have no implication on the overall concept of design controls. So just as under the MDD, there's certain devices, there's those devices above a class 1 that require design controls and will be subject to conformity assessment, including those specific quality management system requirements. So for these types of products, obviously, yeah, those design controls are required.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly right. There has not been any change really significant in relation to the design controls. Similar standards are to be applied. There's obviously a lot more emphasis in that post-market phase. But in terms of the requirements for specific devices, this is still there. That's definitely in line with that same regulatory principle. The next question that we received was more specifically around software development, and the question was how design control process and 6234 software development process can be compared parallelly. So we sort of actually allocated a portion of this presentation to this in terms of the typical implementation within your quality management system. Usually what we tend to see is the overarching quality manual that may be mapped to, for example, your 13485 or your MDSAP companion document to explain how you've implemented the particular overarching standard. And then within that manual or that high-level documentation, you would point to the individual procedures where those controls are defined. So for obviously the design control section, where you've got requirements for design inputs, outputs, and all the likes, you would be pointing to, for example, a satellite procedure that captures your software development process. And that software development process would be documented in line with the 62304 principles. That's the main way we've seen that implemented.
I was going to say, the next question we had was to deal with the cybersecurity requirements. The question was, how do we deal with these requirements? Do we typically see them dealt with internally or externally? And I think what we would usually see is that the identification of the requirements for cybersecurity or for the product is expected to be internal. That the design engineers are the ones who are most intimately familiar with the product and with the requirements and with their users. And that's the appropriate person who really should be identifying those cybersecurity requirements, obviously with reference to the relevant standards and regulations that apply to cybersecurity. So yes, short answer is that yes, the identification of requirements are done internally by the design house, but the actual implementation of those cybersecurity features or really depends on the internal capabilities. In some cases, we would see external partners being involved at this point to actually help to implement those cybersecurity requirements and document them effectively to meet the regulatory requirements. And any external party who's being involved in these consultations with cybersecurity should then be subject to the supplier controls under the quality management system.
Yeah, absolutely. The next question that we had is in relation to experience with audits, and the question posed was that in the past, or the comment made was that in the past, auditors did not look very closely at design controls, but we have seen some changes in relation to that. Do you have any examples of design controls being part of a QMS audit? Yes, absolutely. In fact, that's been probably the majority of the audits that we've supported, particularly if those audits are focused on the legal manufacturer or the design house. Very clearly, design controls has been there from a very long time, and they're usually a main portion of that audit. So it may depend on possibly the geography that you're in, the kinds of products application, or the class that you're in charge of, or even whether you're a contract manufacturer as opposed to the legal manufacturer that's in charge of that design file. And that might be a reason why maybe the focus of the audit that you've experienced has not been focusing specifically on design controls. But certainly when it comes to, I should say, overall implementation of the QMS, audit scopes and the likes, and the reviews from regulators and notified bodies, design control has been pretty much central to the audit. So that's very much in scope.
Yes, I'd absolutely agree with that point. Yep.
Yeah. Excellent. So I think that's pretty much all we've got time for today. However, once again, I'd like to thank you for your attention. If you do have additional questions down the line, we are providing some details on the screen where you'll be able to reach us. Thank you very much for your attention again. We hope that this webinar has been useful and at least has clarified some of those key concepts. We'd be more than happy to support and assist. So if you've got any questions, once again, please reach out, and we'll do our best to support. Thank you very much.
Thank you.